Online communities fading to irrelevancy is a tale as old as the internet itself. But while some still remain in our lexicon as reminders of the past, one that's managed to escape is Something Awful. It's rare to hear any acknowledgement of the site, despite how pivotal it was to the formation of internet culture. There are many reasons for the state of its recognition today, but the biggest likely befalls upon its creator, Richard Kyanka. Placed at the helm of the most influential site in early internet history, he struggled with the responsibility. In many ways, he's left an irreparable stain on the site's legacy. But it's one that we can't let be forgotten, not just for its cultural relevance, but importance as a warning. The rise and fall of Richard Kyanka is one that deserves to be immortalized in internet history, yet until today has remained extremely underdocumented. This is the story of Something Awful and Richard Kyanka's Empire of Dirt. Richard Kyanka was born on May 11, 1976. He grew up in Lee's Summit, Missouri, attending a quiet private high school. Upon graduating, he moved to Nashville, Tennessee, where he enrolled at Vanderbilt University to pursue engineering. Over time, he grew to dislike the field and his surmounting tuition. As a result, he dropped out in junior year, instead finding work on campus. With this free time, Rich began to familiarize himself with the internet. He started a website called Arc Central and began playing the newly released Quake 2. Quake is often said to have pioneered online gaming. Its popularity spawned a multitude of fan sites. The most popular was Planet Quake, a repository for user-created mods. In a time before even Newgrounds existed, this was a luxury. In 1999, the site's parent company received an angel investment from entrepreneur David Burkus. This allowed Planet Quake to expand. In their search for new contributors, they came across Rich, who'd begun writing about the game under the pseudonym Lowtax. Impressed by his knowledge of Quake and knack for humor, they offered him a position as a content director. The dropout accepted and traveled to Southern California to begin his first tenure as a writer. Given full creative control, he developed an on-site persona called Cranky Steve to insult the low-quality creations. He also befriended another writer named Kevin Bowen, and together they began a mailbag series. Being paid a $24,000 salary to write about Quake, it was quite the deal. But these good times didn't last. As time went on, higher-ups began to ask for unrealistic metrics, and a lawyer was hired to review everything they wrote. The work became laborious, with Rich often having to work 16-hour shifts just to keep up. But the final straw would be when he managed to actually complete a milestone. Finally achieving their targeted number of users, the CEO rewarded him with a cheap backpack he'd gotten for free at a conference. Inside was a cheap MP3 player valued at $20. Rich recalled feeling terribly insulted, realizing he could be earning more in fast food. After this, he checked out mentally and began to antagonize other employees. In particular, he targeted an older woman their boss had hired. Later calling her a withered hag, he claimed that she was an incompetent writer, and that he had to stay overtime to fix her articles. Rich became so fed up with his extra labor that Cranky Steve eventually released a hit piece about her. He mocked the quality of her articles before deeming her useless. He would later learn that she was the boss's niece. Rich was immediately called into the company's office and confronted by their supervising lawyer. There, he was allegedly forced to sign documents agreeing to be fired in exchange for a month's pay. He had no qualms though, having grown sick of the gig months ago. Something Awful. It was a catchphrase that Rich used to say all the time. That was something awful, he'd remark, almost without thinking. While still employed at Planet Quake, Rich got the idea to register the phrase as a domain. When asked what for, he responded, "I don't know, I just really want to." And he did, paying the $70 fee that night. It was now November of 1999. Having been fired weeks ago, he no longer had a full-time job, but rather than give up on writing, he took it as an opportunity to write beyond the confines of Quake. He spent nearly every day of those next few weeks in his apartment, penning new material, and soon enough, he was publishing them onto Something Awful. From commentary on video games to internet culture and even reality itself, the only rule was that it entertained him. That philosophy was what drew so many people to his site back in the day. In stark contrast to the blind optimism of the dot-com bubble, there was a cynicism towards the internet. Rather than a bright new hope for the future, Something Awful argued that it made you stupid, and was refreshingly self-aware. Rich even created a new character called Jeff K to mock the flood of teenagers online, and slowly but surely he found himself an audience. In 2000, Rich began to work at a gaming publication called Voodoo Extreme. Hosted by the Game Fan Network, they offered to help Lowtax monetize his site if he used their service. This business relationship would only last 2 months. GameFan refused to pay him and when confronted, said they were just having a tough month. He later discovered their contract had a clause stating any ads placed on sites in their network wouldn't be compensated. Apparently, this blatant scamming still wasn't enough to make them profitable as the entire service shut down later that year. He seemed to have a streak of bad luck. Months later, another company called eFront also refused to pay him. By the end of 2001, he'd lost an entire year's worth of revenue. He'd almost given up entirely on making the site sustainable. However, there was still one avenue left to explore. From the start, Something Awful had a forum linked on its front page. It'd been implemented rather half-heartedly, but gradually it began to attract users who shared Rich's sense of humor. From original commentary to Photoshop battles, it completely outshined the original site. Rich tried his best to accommodate. With the help of Kevin Bowen, he turned their Photoshop threads into an official site event. Another section was created called Comedy Goldmine to highlight the funniest posts in the forum. People he found especially funny were even allowed to write for the front page. In the summer of 2000, one of the community's in-jokes would escape. It centered around a mistranslation found in the Sega Mega Drive port of Zero Wing. During a cutscene, the antagonist states, "All your base are belong to us." The phrase became the basis for edits on the forum before quickly spreading to other communities. And then it was everywhere, being reported in news publications and even leading to a live television hijacking. Something Awful had made its first meme, the first mark in its online legacy. By spring, the forum had amassed over 10,000 users. This newfound attention was both exciting and a concern for Rich. While he now had one of the largest forums on the internet, the growing community led his monthly expenses to enter the thousands. So in November of 2001, Lowtax implemented a $10 activation fee. Those attempting to visit without an account were now greeted with a vulgar message reading,
"I pay for this server. I pay for this bandwidth. I'm tired of having to fork over half my paycheck from my full-time job just so people can use my forums and read my site for free. This is not an intelligent business equation for me. I have no problem giving people free services as long as I don't have to pay for the luxury of providing something to you for free. I don't care what people like you think, since you apparently live in some imaginary world where fairies and elves dance under licorice trees and the family dog that you have sex with every day is actually a beautiful princess who doesn't try to chew off your penis."
The user base took it surprisingly well. After all, they got to keep their accounts for free, and people were far less likely to troll with money on the line. It pretty much solved the spam bot problem. The site only continued to grow in traffic, becoming not only sustainable, but quite profitable. In April of 2003, the forum listed 12,000 registered members. Just a year later, that number doubled. The forum had grown a life of its own. Its users began to organize raids, raiding online games, and even rigging a poll to have Lowtax named Entertainer of the Year. During one incident, users flooded the guest book of a site mocked on the front page. This caused the owner to leave an angry message on the forum, referring to them as goons. The name stuck, becoming synonymous with members of the community. On the other hand, they were selective in who they allowed to stay. The site had initially allowed pornography, though this created issues with advertisers. Even after its removal, many of those users stayed. Eventually, in October of 2003, Lowtax personally intervened to purge the forum of who he called undesirables. This mainly consisted of furries and anime fans. One 15-year-old goon was so infuriated by this that he decided to create a splinter site completely free of restriction. This image board would go on to become known as 4chan. For the first 5 years of its life, Something Awful was the life force of internet culture. If you saw anything funny online, chances are it could be traced back to the site. From YTMNDs to Let's Plays and even the association of the impact font with memes, the list just goes on. Some have posited that it was responsible for popularizing cringe culture. Its front page featured a daily awful link for users to mock. Chris Chan, the internet's most infamous lolcow, was discovered on the forum first in 2007. It's also credited with creating irony posting. Intense infighting became so toxic that an entire subforum was created for containment, appropriately called Fuck You and Die. However, it quickly devolved from genuine arguments to what they called fake posting, becoming a place for shitposts and subversive comedy. Drill, as well as other classic weird Twitter accounts, began as goons from FYAD. Something Awful was truly ahead of its time, becoming a memetic powerhouse, and Lowtax, by complete luck, had stumbled into being its leader. In 2005, he was invited to speak at 2 different universities about the site's origin and impact.
Folks are really attracted to communities, obviously, which appeal to them. Something Awful started with me just writing stuff that appealed to me. If I thought it was funny, then I'd put it up. And what that did was bring in people who have the same kind of sense of humor, and that way it makes the community click more because, everybody gets along with each other more or less because it's crap that appeals to them.
By that point, Something Awful had become the largest paid forum on the internet, with 50 new accounts every day. The staff team had grown to over 50 moderators, made up of mostly volunteers. It even managed to produce its own convention, where 300 members of the forum traveled to meet each other at a venue in Las Vegas. In keeping with the tradition of supporting outstanding users, Richard created Awful Video to distribute DVDs for the then newly established Omega 64. He was essential to helping get them off the ground. He also reached out to an artist who became admired for their work ethic. They'd produce comics and simple animations in response to threads. In 2004, Lowtax gave them their own weekly series on the front page called Flash Tub. This artist's name was Shmorky. In his speech at the University of Illinois, Rich emphasized just how important it was for the site to be run by someone who cared.
These corporations, if they want to sit down and say, yeah, I want to build a website that's going to attract a lot of people, but if they don't have actually somebody who cares, who actually gives a shit about the people there, then nobody's going to go there. And so, that's the thing. You actually have to, have a heart and actually care about what you're doing to keep it going.
Yet only months after the lecture, he seemed to fall out of love with the site, becoming less active on the forums and rarely publishing anything. Before long, he was directly contradicting the values he espoused.
The problem is, when you actually start running ads, you start alienating the people who are there.
On May 17th, 2006, Lowtax posted a thread declaring how much he enjoyed mangosteen products and included an Amazon referral link. When called out, he responded with a bizarre amount of anger.
So don't fucking buy it. Don't fucking drink it. Don't fucking click my links. I mean, Christ, all I did was make this thread to support a product which actually pleasantly surprised me, and folks are voting this thread crap and suggesting I'm scamming them. I'm going back to FYAD and staying there, since it has a microscopic fraction of the retards and trolls populating GBS. I guess that should strike me as being ironic, but it's more sad to me than anything. Thanks for running me out of my own goddamn forum.
He subsequently banned every user who negatively rated the thread, before blacklisting the term mangosteen from the site entirely. Rich had developed an ego, which only led people to antagonize him more. After this, Something Awful grew largely independent of him, though there would be one last hurrah. In June, notorious film director Uwe Boll issued a press release challenging critics to a 10-round boxing match. While Rich had never written about him before, other contributors had, catching Boll's attention. Realizing the opportunity, he asked to be included anyways and quickly penned a review.
I did not come to kick ass, I came here for the free trip to Vancouver.
The event occurred on September 23rd at an entertainment complex in Vancouver, Canada. Dressed in an all-American outfit, Lowtax would be the second fighter to compete.
The Deutschland Destroyer, the Teutonic Terror, Dr. Uwe Boll!
He stood no chance, lasting only 3 minutes before being counted out in the first round.
Is he gonna get up? He's up. Is he ready to fight? He's gonna fight some more.
He's ready to go. He's not giving up.
Oh, there's a big right hand.
In the post-match interview, he alleged that Boll had told him it was just for show and he wouldn't actually be beaten.
To all my fans, I would have to say, if an angry German man challenges you to a boxing match and you've had absolutely no training, and then he says, okay, well, yeah, I'll train you before, and then he doesn't, and then he says, well, it doesn't matter, I'm not going to hit you really hard, and then he does, you have a good reason to hate him a lot.
The director went on to defeat all 5 challengers, even leaving one vomiting on the street. While Something Awful remained a substantial force for years, by 2008 it lost much of its monopoly. Other competing sites began to overtake it in notoriety. YouTube and Newgrounds edged into its territory of content creation. 4chan would usurp its throne as the most toxic, developing its own reputation for creating internet trends. And finally, with the advent of social media as well as content aggregators like Reddit, forums as a whole fell by the wayside. That's not to say it became totally obsolete, but the internet was changing and Something Awful retired from the frontier. Many users saw this as a good thing, however. They never actually liked the attention, viewing memes as the death of comedy. And while some ideas still escaped, namely Slenderman in 2009, they took comfort in fulfilling a niche and nothing more. One thing neglected from the record so far was Rich's personal life. Due to Something Awful's enormous profits, Rich no longer had to work a day job, and so, with his only responsibility being the site, he spent his free time lusting for life. He had several brief relationships over the years. The first was with a woman his mother introduced him to before moving to California. They celebrated her 21st birthday together, with their meeting forever immortalized on video. In the background, several goons awkwardly crack jokes about a Linux computer they'd brought.
What's that?
It's an alternative operating system, kind of like a hip-hop operating system, but different. That's right.
They later broke up due to compatibility issues. Afterwards, he began a long-distance relationship with Emily Regal, who contributed under the username Integral. By 2002, the two were engaged, a promising step to their future. However, just a year later, the couple broke up, with details of their fallout publicly aired out on the front page. On March 18, 2003, Lowtax published an article titled What I Learned Last Week by Rich Kyanka, age 26. In it, he advises the reader to never get involved with a crazy woman. He calls her a pathological liar, stating that she'd lied to him about her occupation and dating history. The final straw would be an incident in which the two had arranged to meet. Emily claimed that while boarding the plane, she was stopped by government officials and prevented from flying. He later discovered that his fiancée had lied, never having left home. By May, Lowtax became wealthy enough to purchase a house back in his hometown of Missouri.
My new house.
Months later, he registered Something Awful as an LLC. It was becoming a legitimate business, with some admins even flown in to work full-time in his basement. In 2004, Rich began dating another member of the forum, a 23-year-old woman named Megan Austin. They began embarking on expensive international vacations together before she moved in with him for good. Soon enough, they were engaged, and by February of 2005, officially married. In attendance at the Cancun wedding were Shmorky as well as the Mega 64 crew. Four months after that, Megan would give birth to their first daughter, Lauren, on June 27th. The relationship progressed at an alarming rate, one that spelled out disaster from the very beginning. In the moment, Rich was happy and rightfully chose to prioritize family over the forum. But by the time they had their second daughter, Jalen, in 2008, things had changed. Megan was always highly religious, while Rich hated Christianity. Megan wanted to protect her children from curse words, while Rich had no filter around them. These simple differences grew into deep resentment, to the point that they couldn't live in the same house together. In 2010, the couple made their first attempt at filing a divorce, though it was quickly dissolved by both parties. Around that time, Lowtax began renting a strip mall office under the guise of being Something Awful's headquarters. It instead became a place for him to hide out from the mess that his home life had become. With Something Awful being his only creative aspiration, he felt lifeless. He stopped taking care of himself and walked around the office barefoot in a stained t-shirt and basketball shorts. He eventually suggested Smorky move nearby to work in person.
Smorky, I'm streaming right now and the camera is pointed right at you.
Together, they began a Let's Play channel called Gaming Garbage to riff on poorly made video games. While focusing on his own site, Smorky also produced animations for the channel, with a highlight being the cartoons he made based on stories by Rich's daughters. One thing that's never been made clear is exactly how much Rich made from Something Awful. Using the Internet Archive, I was able to construct a rough fossil record of the site's user registrations. Before we analyze this data, it's worth clarifying that this excludes any additional revenue sources. That means banner ads, merchandise, as well as any money made from account upgrades. Using these numbers, we can estimate Rich earning nearly $2 million from 2004 to 2020. Remember, these are low estimates. During the site's peak, the forum generated on average $150,000 every year, with a peak of over $200,000 in 2008. Rich was not just well off, but wealthy. The software used to build the forum, vBulletin 2, was standard in 2001, but was quickly made obsolete due to security issues. Something Awful continued to use it for over 2 decades, resulting in thousands of accounts being compromised. The archaic software also led the forum to be extra expensive, requiring more servers to accommodate. For the longest time, the site didn't even have a functional search engine. One would expect Lowtax to at least put some of the money into upgrading the site, but he didn't. Believing the money would never stop coming in, he instead leased a 2011 Nissan GT-R to the company. In early 2014, Rich and Megan finally divorced. He was ordered to pay her thousands every month for the next 3 years in alimony and child support. It's perhaps no coincidence that he announced the offices would be closed soon after. Rich put out an open invitation to anyone interested in visiting, offering free merchandise. It's said that when somebody did arrive, they found him passed out on the couch with pills and empty bottles nearby. While visiting a friend in Canada, he was introduced to a young woman named Ashley Martin. Despite not being familiar with the site, they hit it off quickly, and by the end of the trip, she flew home with him to Missouri. Less than a year after getting divorced, the now 40-year-old was not only in another relationship, but remarried. And on April 11th, 2016, Ashley gave birth to his third daughter, Salone. The change gave him a new purpose in life. He cleaned up, quickly losing over 20 pounds. He even tried to get sober, attending rehab. Ashley was wooed by his lavish lifestyle, impressed by the aforementioned GT-R. Over time, however, conflicts arose that made her reconsider. While still pregnant, the two had dinner at a Chinese buffet. Without asking, Rich decided to publicly invite members of the forum, though none came. Then he began drinking and launched into what she described as a schizophrenic-like spiel about being kidnapped by the government. Even though his pregnant wife began to cry, he didn't stop. As mentioned before, Ashley was not a goon. She only registered her account after meeting Rich. And yet, on March 7th, 2016, Lady Ambien was promoted to moderator. One would expect this to be a disaster, but she was respectful and actually rather well liked by the community. In fact, Ashley would make more of an attempt to moderate the forums than Rich did. In 2008, Something Awful introduced the subforum Laissez Faire. Intended to be a simple containment board for politics, it quickly grew in activity. Before long, it was the site's biggest draw, becoming the second largest board on the site. Lowtax despised this fact. It ran contrary to what he believed the internet was for, not caring. Additionally, it developed an atmosphere he later called a more pathetic version of 4chan. But because it attracted new users, read money, he tolerated it. But in November of 2014, a post was made threatening the life of President Barack Obama. It was so controversial that it led the Secret Service to visit Rich's home and question him. He was so furious that he immediately shut down the board entirely. Nowhere left to go, the users who joined for politics began to disseminate. Those who chose to stay spread to the rest of the site, slowly warping the entire forum. Rich, having long since checked out, didn't care. But Ashley did. She found it bizarre that staff were banning users for posting unpopular opinions in the debate and discussion section. This was met with intense backlash from the site's staff, with many threatening to leave. Despite the ultimatum, she was forced to back off. The forum only survived because of volunteers. Without them, there would be no one left to moderate. Following the closure of the strip mall office, Shmorky had gathered an internet presence of his own. He grew in popularity on Twitter and Tumblr, eventually leveraging that success into professional gigs for companies such as Adult Swim. The two began to grow apart, however, due to political differences and Shmorky's toxic personal life. In August of 2016, Rich uploaded a video to the Gaming Garbage channel mocking Shmorky's voice. Months later, by complete coincidence, Shmorky would be exposed for engaging in inappropriate conversations with minors. Rich felt a pit form in his stomach. He'd allowed Shmorky to interact with his children. While thankfully Shmorky hadn't done anything to them, he felt obligated to have a serious discussion about the ordeal with his eldest daughter. This included explaining fetishes, pedophilia, and sociopathy to the 11-year-old. With the community plateauing at just over 200,000 users, the money began to dry up. Accustomed to earning tens of thousands every month, in 2015 alone, that income halved. His expenses, meanwhile, only increased. In addition to the divorce settlement, he began to suffer from a variety of medical problems. At one point, 2 vertebrae in his neck completely broke apart, causing him to lose control of the entire nervous system on the left side of his body. First misdiagnosed as muscle pain, it took 4 months before doctors took him seriously. The pain was so intense afterward that it left him bedridden for 6 months. Even streaming became too difficult to do. The numerous hospital visits and appointments led him to accumulate a $60,000 debt. This forced him to withdraw his entire 401k, though it still wasn't enough. On March 12, 2019, in a bit of desperation, Lowtax wrote a lengthy post to the forum about the state of affairs. If something didn't change, he wouldn't be able to host the site any longer.
I've been seriously depressed for a couple of years because my injuries and situation have severely limited the things I can do, and it's made me feel absolutely useless and incapable of doing the things I want and need to do. I just want enough money to live, watch my children grow up, somewhat manage the things going on in Something Awful, and be happy. I just fucking want to survive and be happy with what I do.
Realizing just how dire the situation had become, users of the forum became sympathetic to their once distant father. They quickly mobilized and began donating to his Patreon. Within a day, it grew from a humble $2,000 to over $10,000 a month. Something Awful had been saved from the brink of collapse, and Rich, as well as the rest of the internet, was thrilled. As his health improved and with the site no longer in jeopardy, one would think he'd be in good spirits. This was the good ending, a happy conclusion. But everybody would be blindsided by what happened next. Because on November 25th, 2019, Rich posted on Facebook that his wife had kidnapped their daughter. In the post, Rich claimed that Ashley had taken $3,000 from his bank account, disabled her cell phone, and fled with their 2-year-old child. He immediately called the police, asking for an Amber Alert, only to be denied. Hours later, he wrote a second update with further context.
My wife and daughter are, according to the police, somewhere in the area, but they cannot tell me where because if a woman claims to be afraid of a man, and they don't require any evidence to do so, they can take your family members and hide for as long as they want. This is absolutely fucking insane. I've never threatened or laid a hand on my wife, yet all she has to do is claim she's afraid of me.
Details on the alleged kidnapping were hazy at first. Many were sympathetic to Rich, believing that the incident was unjust. But then, more information about these circumstances began to surface. Rich had spent that entire month in Utah embarking on a supposed business trip. He carried with him a pitch for the sequel to Doomhouse, a classic Something Awful video. In reality, however, his intention was to hook up with the person he was meeting. Rather than celebrate Thanksgiving with his family, he was instead in Salt Lake City with a woman he'd met online. Like his first marriage, once the honeymoon phase had ended, the relationship fell apart. They stopped being intimate together, something he complained about publicly. Rich and Ashley had few common interests, which he couldn't even pretend to care about. These differences escalated to multiple domestic disputes, including one that allegedly ended with her slapping him. That December, Rich announced the formal pursuit of a divorce, proclaiming he'd have her deported back to Canada. He then used her phone to track down the exact shelter she'd escaped to, causing her to be moved by authorities for her safety. On January 21st, 2020, Ashley would speak publicly about the situation for the first time. That day, she created a GoFundMe with a detailed explanation as to why she left. She explained that Rich was in control of all her finances, making it impossible to save and leave. Ashley claimed that Rich used her undocumented status to control her, as seen publicly a month prior. The campaign asked for only $3,000 and was closed shortly after reaching the amount. That same day, Lowtax's first wife Megan became involved with the case. That morning, she spoke to law enforcement out of fear for Ashley's safety. She affirmed that Rich was not only emotionally abusive, but physically abusive as well. As proof, Megan submitted a police report from during their marriage regarding a previously unknown incident. Dated March 26, 2013, it reads as follows.
Megan said her husband, later identified as Richard Kyanka, was at their house, lying in bed about to fall asleep with their 2 children in between them. Megan said she had her phone in her hand when her husband attempted to take it from her. Megan said she held onto her phone tight and even bit her husband. Megan said her husband dug his fingernails into her fingers, forcing her to release the phone. Megan said her husband then grabbed her throat and forced her back. Megan was able to break free from his grip and said she grabbed her children and ran out to her car and left the residence in only their pajamas, in fear of their safety.
While Rich denied the allegations to police, they observed blood and missing skin from multiple fingers on both of Megan's hands. Throughout the collapse of his second marriage, the woman he'd had an affair with moved in. The 25-year-old Logan Day believed Rich's side of events, as together they pursued a romantic and business relationship. She became the company's chief operating officer, which as a longtime fan of the site, felt like a dream. As time went on, however, those rose-tinted glasses wore down. She began to stop seeing Rich as the man she thought he was, but instead the person he became. They started to get into arguments, and eventually, those two allegedly escalated to violence. On June 24th, 2020, Logan posted a distressing message to Facebook claiming that Rich had backhanded her to the floor. According to the police report, she'd attempted to wake him up, leading him to angrily pick her up off the floor and throw her to the ground. She then revealed that the Patreon money was spent leasing that year's GTR model, as well as gourmet cookies. Shortly after these allegations were made, police reports regarding Megan and Ashley's abuse were also made public. And with now 3 credible accusations of abuse against Rich, people finally made their decision. That day, one of the writers on Something Awful published a letter directed towards Lowtax, reading,
Lowtax, you are the single source of every one of your problems. You allowed one of the best communities to accrue around you and then utterly, totally, completely squandered it. You are an active impediment to the site's success, and your refusal to sort your shit out will be the reason it dies forever. Maybe it should have died years ago.
They then called for users to stop supporting him on Patreon. The fallout led him to effectively lose his entire audience, going from nearly $8,000 every month to just $1,000 overnight. In response, Lowtax would stream again for the first time in months, denying the allegations. He was a slurred, barely coherent mess, and filled the screen with a looping video of a dog puking.
Are we doing this, yo? You guys seeing me? Hear me?
Where before, many sympathized with him and paid respects for changing the online landscape forever, now he had no one. He continued streaming, barely able to maintain just 10 viewers. Even his oldest daughter, who acted as a sidekick during previous live streams, left him. And all he had left was a community who hated him. On October 9th, 2020, Rich officially signed away the rights to Something Awful, forfeiting the site and company to a 15-year member of the community named Jeffrey. His final words to the empire he'd built over 2 decades ago were goodbye and good riddance. To commemorate the sale, both of Lowtax's ex-wives took a photo together congratulating Jeffrey. People often point out that if sold at the right time, Something Awful could have been turned into a multi-million-dollar empire. When the forum was peaking in 2007, the declining E-Bombs world managed to be sold for $15 million. Just recently, gaming forum Reset Era was acquired for $4.5 million. If Rich had sold at the right time, he'd never have to work again, and his various debts would have likely been no issue.
This reminds me of something I could share now. Lowtax told me he got a buyout offer from a media company for $13 million in 2006. He was still having fun with the site and turned it down. He expressed lament at this to me during our own negotiations.
Given he was planning on leaving anyways and planned on starting a family, it would have been the responsible thing to do. Interestingly, Rich addressed this in his post about financial issues. He argued that Something Awful was never intended to be a big website, and he refused to sell even if it meant losing money because he had to keep this place true to himself. Whether you believe him or not, Something Awful was his life's work, an outlet of pure creative vision that evolved into one of the most influential communities of all time. And just like that, with nothing left to lose, it was sold. While the exact amount was never disclosed, it's estimated to be in the 6 figures. Though it now sat at under $200 a month, Rich had made over $100,000 in total from Patreon. In combination with how much he made from selling the forum, he was far from bankrupt. To his remaining patrons, he proclaimed that if he was ever found legally guilty, he'd double their pledge. And this was the defense he stuck to, that he was so far legally innocent. Amidst COVID, Ashley was tasked with raising their daughter in a space the size of a dorm room. They were rarely ever allowed to leave. Sometimes, Megan and her daughters would visit after complying with the mandatory 2-week quarantine. But surviving and affording the court proceedings was difficult. At the end of 2020, however, Ashley received her first legal victory, a custody agreement that allowed her to return to Canada with their daughter. Lowtax, on the other hand, began streaming. A shadow of his former self, he spent most of 2021 live on the Gaming Garbage channel. There was little in the way of commentary beyond drunken slurring and proclamations of innocence. He even decided to re-upload animations the disgraced Schmorky had made of his daughters. When not playing video games, he was spending hundreds of thousands of dollars on luxury goods. Money that could have been saved for his children and their education was squandered for instant gratification. It's estimated he ran through nearly $500,000. On November 8, 2021, Ashley Martin won her final victory in court. She was granted 1/5 of the marital estate, as well as 2.5 years of child support. The judge also ruled that Rich had willfully spent the marital fund, meaning he was intentionally wasting money in order to avoid paying her. The judge also confirmed that his treatment of her was in fact domestic violence. While Rich had lost the battle, he was not being cut out of his daughter's life entirely. In fact, he was due to see his daughter for the first time in 2 years on Christmas. Instead, the next day, Ashley was contacted again by her attorney. In the early hours of November 9th, 2021, Rich had taken his own life at the age of 45. In many ways, Something Awful grew in spite of him rather than because of him. With the continued success of the site's ideas and creators, the clear difference is that they could evolve, while Lowtax couldn't. Until his very last breath, he kept repeating the same mistakes. Eventually, people began to realize that they weren't mistakes, but intentional decisions. In 2000, Rich began writing for an online gaming publication called Voodoo Extreme. The site was run by a man named Billy Wicked Wilson, whose sharp sense of humor defined the site. But despite this, he was an alcoholic and addicted to drugs, leaving Rich to often take care of him. He recalled that Billy was severely depressed, and though he had a loving family and children, he couldn't find happiness in life. After leaving the publication, Rich wrote a heartfelt letter for Billy expressing how much he cared.
You may feel alone in this world, but there are people who love and care for you, even if they do not know how to show it. Even if they do not know how to show it properly. You are much stronger than you think, and cannot let your negative emotions dictate your life. You will survive, and you will get stronger, and you will learn to trust people once again.
Unfortunately, he was never able to deliver it, as the next day, Billy was found dead, having committed suicide. Lowtax was once quite an admirable figure online. He tirelessly worked to support a community he truly cared for. But by the end, he'd alienated everyone, to where not even his own children wanted to visit, and he had no one to blame but himself. It was only due to his own decisions that Lowtax ended up that way. Instead of investing into his future, he spent his wealth on luxuries. Instead of reflecting on what went wrong in his relationships, he rushed into new ones. And rather than atone for his sins, he intentionally sabotaged the estate, leaving his children without savings or a father. Something awful is largely forgotten by the internet, and with its fading relevancy, so too is the legacy of Lowtax, his once all-encompassing internet empire eroded by the sands of time.
And you can have it all. My empire of dirt. I will let you down. I will make you hurt. I wear this crown.